Thanks, Deborah, and thank all of you for coming tonight and for the several hours I've already spent in discussions and back and forth with many of the students on the campus and some of the faculty. So my brain is overworked a bit. I may repeat things that I just said an hour ago. When you start getting up and leaving, I'll know that it's time to go to the questions and answers. And I'm sorry I can't get closer to you. I feel like I'm in the mothership here. And I didn't bring any graphics or cartoons, just words. And not sure where to begin, but the way to perhaps key my remarks, if you want to call them that, is the title. What did we settle on, Deborah?
Students' unemployment to the end of the world.
I thought there was a third problem in it. Yeah, but it was that'll do. The future of students' unemployment and the end of the world, something like that. Well, it's kind of a I doubt that it got your attention because you already know that you're facing shrinking job prospects that pay good wages, and you're being told over and over by our best scientists that the world is ending, and we're already going through the end game, and it's not what some of the fundamentalist Christians have predicted. It's due to weather patterns. I would add another interesting challenge that there's some data I've seen, and I think it's solid, that says yours is the first generation that will live less long than your parents and be sicker.
Yes.
You'll have more health problems and you'll live less lengthy lives. So you have a shortened lifespan, which is perhaps good facing the end of the world. Perhaps not. And I say this because I'm often asked to speak or teach and make comparisons with the 60s or student movements over the years, and I have to remind myself that we're talking about 50 years ago, and certainly the 60s are very much in people's consciousness and unconsciousness, but time moves along, and we'll get into some of what happened in the 60s, I'm sure, but the point I want to make is that each generation seems to have very unique challenges that are frightening in their time, that are not of their doing, that are the result of their parents' doing. And this is why we have often a generational factor that's very, very strong in social movements or revolutions, whether it's in this country or other countries, because young people, for reasons that are hard to really understand, face a question when they're your age about whether they're content to settle with what their parents have left them, or whether they find it unacceptable, they're restless with it, they don't want to live with it any longer. In my generation, it was students, African American students, living under segregation that had been in place for 100 years since the murder of Lincoln. Brutal segregation, unemployment, second-class status, left to them by their parents' generation. Not to blame the parents entirely, but it's the legacy that we're talking about. And the students in Mississippi, Alabama, North and South Carolina, Georgia, had to decide, each and every one of them, whether they would settle for it and accept the idea of growing up as an adult and living out their lives and going to the grave under the same system of domination that their parents had been unable to deliver them from. President Obama mentions this now and then when he talks about the history of social movements asks his audiences whether you're ready to settle for this, and I think he knows that he's going to succeed only if people are restless and they will not settle. They will fight for something that seems improbable, but you never know. And for us, there was the 100-year problem of segregation. People couldn't vote, didn't have a voice, enforced by vicious brutality, dogs, jails, guns. On top of that, there was the Cold War, which no one will necessarily remember, but it was a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union in which both sides had thermonuclear weapons, and it was characterized by a nuclear arms race, with the evidence being that if the arms race ever turned hot, that's what was called the Cold War, if it ever became a hot war, the world would be destroyed. Those are only two of the things that motivated my generation to act out of necessity because we couldn't accept those futures. And we took action not knowing what the outcome would be, just knowing that it was intolerable at our age to accept this world. It couldn't be done. It turned out we've come a long way, and I'm not saying it's been altogether positive, but we've come a long way from the days when the people we were working with in Mississippi couldn't vote but could get killed for trying, to the days that Barack Obama has been reelected President of the United States. He was about 3 during the years I'm speaking of. I don't remember a single person in the student civil rights movement who said, we're fighting to elect a black president. But more to the point, I don't remember anybody ever saying that we would have a black president. It just seemed like an inconceivable notion. At the time, in half the United States, it was a criminal act for people of separate races to fall in love, to have sex, and be married and have children. It was against the law to have interracial relationships. So the idea that, somehow there would be an Obama presidency was not under consideration, as I recall, and I should know. And I keep asking, any of you remember ever discussing this hypothetical event? Secondly, I went through my own version of the end of the world. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can find it on your History Channel if you look. There was the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, with other countries serving as proxies or allies. In this case, Cuba, which had had a revolution in 1959, and our government, under President Kennedy, tried to stop the revolution, then overthrow it by an invasion. And then it came by 1962, late 1962, to the crisis in which it turned out that the Cubans, in a sort of delusional belief that they could protect the United States from attacking Cuba, allowed the Soviets to establish missile bases in Cuba, as the famous saying went, 90 miles from our shore. And the United States discovered this, found it unacceptable, and according to the military doctrine of the time, the solution was for Cuba and the Soviet Union to back down, or we would attack them and it would go atomic. There's a difference you might not know between atomic and nuclear. They're both bad, but nuclear is infinitive, it's beyond the mind. We saw the Cold War as a long diversion during our parents' lifetime away from doing anything about jobs and education and justice at home, and spending all our tax dollars on more and more of these weapons of mass destruction. and we blamed both sides, but we wanted to end the arms race between the two superpowers before it ended us. And so we were in Washington. I don't remember how many of us, wasn't very many, but we went to a chapel, and at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a very revered journalist in the older generation, I.F. Stone, gave a speech as an expert saying that the lines had been crossed, the time had come, the missiles were about to be released from Cuba, and we were at the end of the world. And I don't want you to have to experience this, but I hope that you can imagine how unimaginable it is to think that in the next minutes, all life on the planet will be obliterated. I was so disturbed, I went into denial and I had a cheeseburger. Well, what else are you going to do? Other people had sex. Other people lost it. They just lost it emotionally. And that experience of imagining at any moment an atomic blast going through your world is unforgettable. The important thing that I draw from it, I'm not much of an optimist, but I always look for my angles, is that it didn't happen. Dear friends, neighbors, and children, it didn't occur. And people were telling us it was inevitable. There were even scientists putting out a magazine saying that it's 5 minutes to midnight. If we don't end the nuclear arms race, it'll end all life on the planet. And we had this personal experience with the world ending. And it's really hard to communicate how deeply traumatic that experience was. So I have had experience with problems being imposed on us from the past where we thought our parents had failed and nothing had changed for 100 years. That was the Deep South. And an experience with the prediction of the end of the world and living through it. I don't remember that I had much experience with the belief that my life would be shorter than my parents. That may be more unique. But what I'm saying is that I'm here, and I need to tell you that you have to look these apocalyptic problems in the face. Do not escape them. Don't run away. Don't hide from it. Don't say it's too much. Just face it. And you will find that it's the only human solution to the problem. The problem of youth unemployment, the problem of rising tuitions, the economic inequality, and the threat of global warming or extreme weather. It doesn't mean I'm a rosy optimist. You are already in this dire economic situation. It is going to get worse. You are already in global warming. You're just kidding yourself if you don't understand that the planet is being altered and that the sources we draw on for life support as human beings are being threatened, and it will only get worse. No doubt about that. The question then is, well, what do you do about it? I'd like to hear from you, but it does seem to me the only advice one can give is that human beings, especially when they're young, are malleable, adaptable, elastic, can confront crises, that we're all survivors of disastrous evolutionary events in the past. The traumas of past extinctions are within us, mass exterminations, poverty like you can't even imagine today, all that within us, migrations, upheavals, all that within us. And so we do have resources of creativity And that's all that we can really depend upon in order to come up with solutions to these crises. It almost sounds like I believe in great leaps forward or sudden evolutionary adaptations. I do. For want of a better concept, it's extinction or adaptation. Some people will have the death wish, but most people have the adaptive capabilities that have allowed us to survive and function for a long time. So it's just a question of where you want to start. Often we wait for Obama to solve the problem, we wait for our parents, we wait for the LA Times to clarify it, we wait for the government, we wait for Bill Gates, we wait for Apple, we wait. And it's typical of people that they wait for the institutions to solve the problem that the institutions have created or done nothing about. And at a certain point, when there's a huge realization that we can't wait for the institutions because they may actually be causing our problems, then and only then do social movements arise. And I want to spend a moment on the definition here. By a social movement, or maybe we could just say movement, people are not born to be activists, in my judgment. They become activists out of necessity when they feel they have to. Otherwise, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are threatened, then we can't count on others, we have to count on ourselves. And this is why these strange events known as social movements occur. It's usually an unexpected group of people who start small, they become a mass of people. They operate apparently outside of the system on the margins, and they are confronted by people that ignore them, are apathetic towards them, are threatened by them, or want to seduce or bribe them or bring them over for political reasons. They go through a lot of ups and downs, but if they are speaking for something that is intensely human, others will respond to that human connection, particularly if there have been responses in the past that we can rely on. If we know of slave uprisings, if we know about the Warsaw Ghetto, if we know about Dutchess County, New York during the American Revolution, if we know about Selma, Alabama, if we know about Delano, California, all of these place names are actually, they carry with them a lore. We have a loric landscape, a storytelling landscape. There are places where unexpectedly movements have arisen in the places you would least expect. And eventually they gather support and enter the mainstream of discussion and become a contentious subject of politics. An example of what I mean would be Occupy Wall Street, which everybody said later could have been predicted, but no one predicted it at the time, September 16th of that year. No one predicted it, not even the participants. They didn't say, we're going to touch off a change in the conversation from budget cuts to inequality in jobs. So it rapidly spread and was picked up by other people, picked up by the mainstream media. Why it ended, we can speculate. I don't have an opinion, but I kind of think of Occupy Wall Street as a classic case of an unexpected uprising by people who the day before didn't think of themselves as outsiders, but suddenly found themselves taking to the street with their friends and neighbors, and they they had an impact. Perhaps it was only like an electrical storm before the big one. Perhaps it was a rain shower. Perhaps it went away just because the same thing happens with the weather itself. We get premonitions of storms, we get signs of storms, but only when the storm really hits and everybody is underwater do we see what the potential impact can be. So that's how social movements go. And typically, when you least expect it, the establishment accepts the main goal of the social movement, if only to restore peace and quiet and law and order. For 100 years they tried to say women under no circumstances should ever be allowed to vote. Even longer before that, Dolly Madison said, "Remember the ladies," to her husband as he went off on his revolutionary horse. He didn't remember the ladies. Jefferson didn't remember the ladies. But the ladies would not be silenced forever, and it took a very, very long time, but it happened. And along the way, ladies had to decide whether they were really inferior or were equally qualified to vote. That's the internal cultural process. And how important was it really to their power to fight to the death so that women would never vote? And they gradually divided, and it was a very close outcome. Any student of the vote will know that these are not foregone conclusions. As I recall, it took forever to force a vote out of the federal government. Then it had to be ratified in all these states, and it came down to one guy, I think in the Tennessee legislature, who cast the final vote in favor of ratification of the women's right to vote, the amendment, because his mother pushed him. He gave in to his mom. That's what happened. So don't let anybody tell you that there's such a thing as fate or predetermination. Activism and social conflict are very live, and you do make a difference whether you understand it at the time or not. It's very, very intense. And then when the movement achieves its original goal, here's what happens. By then, the people that have put in 10 years or 20 years in the movement no longer want the original goal. They want the whole thing. They want complete revolution. They're sick and tired of the system. And other people are satisfied with winning the goal, and let's try it out, this right to vote that we now have. And on the other side, on the establishment side, one group says it's the beginning of the end. Once the women get the right to vote, at some future time, Hillary Clinton will become president. People say, who? Hillary Clinton, mark my word. And other people say, so what? And it becomes accepted, but there's always tension over whether it's really, really accepted. And we have a whole history of successful reforms in American history. The abolition of slavery, the expansion of the vote to all property owners, then beyond white people, then beyond men. The labor was in the 19th century was considered a conspiratorial violation of free trade. Then we accepted the idea of trade unionism and labor unions. I could go on and on and on, but particularly in the 60s, there was a whole slew of reforms that were achieved that were considered radical when they began and became mainstream by the end of the process, sometimes quickly, sometimes not so quickly. In the case of the Voting Rights Act, the greatest achievement of the early student movement, 1965, it's still before the current Supreme Court, who has been weighing a decision about whether to repeal or amend it. 50 years of the achievement still very much at stake, dependent on probably one vote on the United States Supreme Court. But that's how it goes. We have a country whose best things are the result of radical reforms, or reforms that were considered radical at the time. You know, even at the beginning, only 1/3 were in favor of a revolution against the British. How dumb is that? 2/3 of us were, I don't know, or I'm for them. 2/3. Only 1/3 carried the struggle. And now nobody would say, well, I guess some would say it would have been better if we'd remained under the British Empire, but I haven't heard that argument for a very long time. So that's the process, and the reason I teach a course on democracy is I find that my students are unacquainted with the real emotional and historical depth of the concept of democracy. 200-300 years ago, the dominant idea was the divine right of kings. Monarchs, based on heredity, should rule us generation after generation. The king should perpetuate himself beyond his own lifetime through his son, even if the son is an idiot. It was accepted that the son was the king. The divine right of the king passed to the son. People who opposed that and wrote the Bill of Rights and supported the American Revolution could have at any moment been captured and hung for their belief that there was something funny about the idea of the divine right of kings. You'll be hung for that. People were hung for that. And that's why the landscape is filled with historic clues if you want to follow it. Now, what will we do about the problems of your generation? I would say that the division in the country is not between red and blue. Somebody who's trying to manipulate your mind is telling you there's blue states and red states. Because blue has no significance and red has no significance. Right? It's really a pretty clear division that goes back decades or centuries between the old Confederate South, the white South, plus the Indian killing West, versus New England and the West Coast and the cities. This is, if there are colors, they're not red and blue. And the divide in this country, 50-50, is only a latest morphing of the divide of the Western wars against Native people, the war against Mexico, and the Civil War. And I never realized how long it would take. It may be permanent, but I think what's happening now is somewhat demographic and somewhat the result of social movements. In other words, if you look at the base of the Obama coalition, there are so-called traditional Democrats, but most of that base is not loyal like those old-time people that voted absolutely for their political party as if it was their church. These are people that vote kind of on their intuition about what's in their interest, what's really at stake for them. Young people generally are going to vote for Obama. African Americans, 95%. I would really like to know who the 4% are that voted for Romney. Latinos, 75, 80%. Against the guy that wanted them to deport themselves. That was a joke, no. Asian Americans thought to be conservative. Maybe they are. but they don't want to be deported either. If it's an immigrants' rights issue between Romney and Obama, who are you going to vote for? So there's a consolidation of young people and people of color and traditional Democrats that cluster around working class issues, jobs, and so on, and issue-oriented people who you can kind of classify as environmentalists, and the factor of women remains a heavy factor with a 60% tendency towards Democrats. So there's only a couple of things that the Republicans can do about this. They could change their beliefs, or they can either try to steal elections or buy elections. If that sounds cruel, I don't mean it to be. I'm just trying to get quickly to the point here. The way you buy elections is you get a Republican Supreme Court appointed that stops Al Gore from being president, even though he won the election. Does anyone remember?
Yeah.
He actually won the election. But because of the Electoral College, which was designed to make it possible to create our fair country by giving more advantages to tiny states than to big ones, more advantages than the tiny states deserve. Why would Rhode Island get 2 U.S. senators and California get 2, if not for the compromise that made America possible, compromise between landowners and social movements embodied in the First Amendments, the Electoral College, the rest of it. So the Supreme Court gives the election to Gore. Your generation in childhood therefore lost the opportunity to find out what it would be like to have an environmental president. Lost it. When you lose it, doesn't come back. Maybe Gore would not have been able to deal with the oil and coal industries and pollution and health. Maybe not. Maybe he would have gotten us 10 years closer to dealing with climate change. But what we do know, at least on the positive side, is that for a moment there was an American majority who was going to vote for Al Gore, who was accused of being a lunatic by the Republicans, and they'd already voted for Jerry Brown, who we know is a lunatic, and who had ushered in the greatest change in energy conservation, energy efficiency, solar energy, wind energy, renewables in the history of American politics, and made California much safer, much sounder for the coming climactic storms that are going to hit this state, hit the other states. So it's the inspiring truth, but also the sad fact, is that these politicians did get elected, which proves that there is a constituency to deal with the end of the world and alternatives to climate change. There is a constituency. The way to look at this, it seems to me, is Obama really needed the environmental vote, among others, in order to win. There still are those in the House of Representatives who don't believe there is climate change, or they believe the end of the world should belong to scriptural matters and not be an environmental issue. In any event, Obama has the power to do one thing, or two. He can appoint administrators of the Environmental Protection Agency, and he can set standards for coal emissions, oil emissions, transportation standards, and force industry to adapt. This is not a new idea. As a matter of fact, in 1973, after the 60s, Jerry Brown was elected governor of California during an energy crisis in which the companies in Detroit said they would be leaving the country if there was any demand for them to be more efficient in the manufacture of automobiles. Cars made in Detroit, where I'm from, were getting 12 miles to the gallon. Brown wanted 27. And the outcome of this battle was that California led the country towards fuel-efficient automobiles that were actually competitive economically as well. So what I'm talking about is that if Obama issues new orders to deal with the particulate matter in the atmosphere, the global warming issues, he doesn't need the Tea Party Republicans. He needs the state of California, he needs the state of New York, and about a dozen other states where the majority of Americans live and drive their cars. So some combination of demanding attention to climate change, whether you do it by demonstrating, fine, or by doing an audit of your own school, how much energy is being wasted to hear me go on and on and on. How far are you willing to go towards candlelight? Jefferson read by candle, why not Whittier? How far you want to go, that's your prerogative to push as hard as you can, but don't think that it's completely hopeless, because you can, no matter how bad things are, it would be worse if you do nothing. You need to weatherize, you need to caulk, you need to walk, you need to talk, you need to protect yourself and your friends from the oncoming climactic catastrophe, and make a transition through it after another Hurricane Sandy, or the flooding of San Jose and the Bay Area, which is sure to happen if there's a status quo. You need to make a transition, not like Noah's Ark, but it comes to mind, to energy efficiency, conservation, and renewables. And so this the combination of the politics and the markets of big states like New York and California, with the power of the President of the United States to appoint and to impose constitutional mandates, is a way forward. And you can do it in small ways, as I mentioned, by looking at your own buildings. You can do it in your consumer choices. You can do it as voters. But there's no getting away from the fact that you have to do something, because it is going to happen. This is going to happen. And ending the world as you know it is, I bet, unacceptable to you. So you're not going to let it happen, even if you can't imagine how the hell you're going to reverse it. You are going to reverse it. There is going to be suffering along the way. There are going to be catastrophes, but you're going to keep moving forward, because that's what people do. That's just simply what people do. On the issue of jobs, I only have just one thought that's related to climate, and we can then take some questions. The thing you need to know about jobs is that the goal of economic policy generally is not to create jobs. It's a weird philosophical doctrine that says investment that generates a profit will generate jobs as an outcome. This is nonsense. If you make a profit, you can invest in a machine. You don't need to invest in a job. If you make a profit, you can invest in Mexico. You don't have to invest in Whittier. So there's nothing about the natural working of the capitalist system that generates jobs for people that need jobs. There has to be some combination of capital, labor, government, and consumer behavior that gets us to a point where we consciously say meaningful work is our goal with a decent income. We want our policies to aim at that, because it's really crazy to think that meaningful work with decent income will come about as a byproduct of profitable economic decision making. There's no connection between the two. The jobs will go where there's the cheapest labor, or where there are machines to replace people. So it's a big consciousness change. It's it's not a revolutionary change. It may be a disturbing change for many of you and for people that are part of the status quo, but it has to happen, or otherwise you'll have people going around imagining themselves to suddenly make an app of their own making profitable. How many of you are dreaming of your own app? And one of you may become a millionaire with your little app. But it's not a social, it's not a solution for a majority of people. That's all I'm saying. Another way to look at it is to tie it all together and say, people need a great work. It's almost a theological or moral idea. You need a great work. The great work of our generation was to overcome segregation and prevent the arms race from killing us all. And so we were willing to go to work for money in anti-poverty programs or in inner city schools or become ecologists. But the great work was the important thing. The work for money was the way towards accomplishing the great work. And I have no doubt that the great work today for all of us is to employ all of you and everybody who needs meaningful work in jobs that will save the planet from destruction. People have done this before. You ever been to Europe, Mexico? You've seen those unbelievable churches. Back in the 500 years ago, if you go to Chiapas, San Cristobal, you'll see a church that is a work of art. It's gigantic. It was made by Mexican people 500, 600 years ago. It still stands. It's because at the time they believed that the great work was to give praise to God through building places of worship that were equally moving as the environment itself. And yeah, there was a dark side, there was slavery.
Right.
Yeah, but they made it happen. People worked for the mission of building something. And I think you can't mobilize people for a social movement or new political direction just on the basis of small goals. You need small goals in order to take one step at a time. But what mobilizes people is the idea that something very important is happening and they must pay attention. And if your lives are getting shorter, you're facing miserable economic opportunities, and people are talking about the death of species and ecosystems, what could be more important than to pay attention to that? And I really believe that if you pay attention with great enough intensity, you'll find yourself part of an effort to put us all to work saving the planet. Mark my words, I think this will happen because I think you're capable of it. I've seen it before, and I'll see it again. Thanks very, very much.